Hi, I'm James Miller, and I'll be your philosophy professor for today. One of the common assignments that students get in introductory philosophy classes is to analyze the correspondence between René Descartes, the famous 17th century Enlightenment philosopher, and Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia. The reason the conversation is important is because it explores some of the foundational issues in philosophy of mind. And philosophy of mind, as you'll see, is on the cutting edge of philosophical discussion today. So here's what you should know in order to approach this paper, and here's probably some of what your professor is looking for when you discuss this correspondence and the importance of philosophy of mind. So to understand philosophy papers generally, philosophers like to ask what the world is made of. What is there? Is it made up of atoms? Is it made up of mental things? What all constitutes the known world? And a famous ancient Greek philosopher named Aristotle used a term as he began to talk about what there is. And that term was substance. We don't use the word substance in the same way that Aristotle meant it, but it's important to understand when we get to Descartes. A substance is when matter, all the atoms and particles, come together in a form and form a thing. So the combination of matter and form forms a substance. So for instance, a bunch of atoms and particles and chemicals come together in the shape of a human being and form a human being. And so the human being is a substance, a combination of matter and form. So that's how Aristotle used the term, just in a kind of a broad general way. When we get to Descartes, and Descartes as a philosopher is asking what is there, what is the world made of, he said that he thought the world was made of two substances, the physical and the mental, or the mind and the body. So the distinction was that the physical is extended in space. It has length and width and height and depth. It has shape. It takes space in the world. The mental does not. Thinking takes no space. So the primary characteristic of the mental is thought. It contains thought. It is thought. The physical is extended and the mental is not. The mental is thinking. So Descartes says the world seems to be made up of two substances. And that now famously is referred to as Cartesian dualism. The idea that there are two things and that the concept first came from René Descartes. So Cartesian dualism. This is where philosophy of mind gets fascinating. Philosophy of mind asks the question now, is that the case? Are my brain and my mind two completely separate things, or somehow does the mind arise from the brain? Descartes was known as a dualist. Most philosophers today, particularly philosophers of mind, are actually called monists. They don't believe that there's two things, they believe there's only one thing. And that one thing is the physical universe. Somehow our minds, or mental things, arise from or are part of the physical universe. They are not a separate substance. And this is the heart of philosophy of mind. And this is fascinating because philosophy of mind does something that few other disciplines do. It bridges a number of different fields in one investigation. So it incorporates the neuroscience, which is the hardware of the brain, with psychology, which is the software of the brain, and philosophy, which ties it all together through critical thinking. So philosophy of mind is fascinating because it says, hey, how are our minds and our brains related? What's up there? What's that gray goo in our heads? And how does it somehow create mind and thought and conversation and the ability to perceive things that are far away? How does all that work? Now, it's important to realize what philosophy of mind is doing because this is one of the more practical areas of philosophy in our world today. Generally, philosophy is chastised for being a janitor of the natural sciences, that it goes along sweeping up behind the questions that all the natural sciences have already talked about. This is kind of a change through the course of history. The ancients referred to philosophy as the queen of the sciences. Until Clement of Alexandria, an early Christian theologian, said that no, philosophy is only the handmaiden of theology. Theology should be the mother of the sciences, and philosophy just the handmaiden. John Locke, an Enlightenment philosopher in the 17th century, would then say, no, actually philosophy is the handmaiden of the natural sciences, so it's taken a step down further still. And today, people will quip that philosophy is just the janitor of the sciences. So philosophy has had a downwardly mobile career throughout history. But in fact, this is a part of philosophy that's fascinating because the empirical sciences, the neuroscience, the study of the physical world, depend on reason. They can't create reason. The empirical method of investigation, forming hypotheses and testing data, that presupposes and depends upon reason. So reason, or critical thinking, is still the property of philosophy. And so now here philosophy is on what is the cutting edge of medical science as well as philosophical investigation, saying let's explore neuroscience, let's explore psychology, but then let's ask the big philosophical question, what is the world really made of? Are there two substances? Are there one? Are there more? And that's where we get to the conversation that Descartes has with Elisabeth. As I said, Descartes is a dualist. He believes there are two things, the physical, which is extended in space, and the mental, which is the realm of thought. Elisabeth, in 1643, begins to write him letters, and they would correspond over the course of 7 years until Descartes died in 1650 on a whole range of different subjects. They talk about different areas of philosophy and politics, but she writes him first, having read his Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy, and has questions for him about how minds and brains relate. And she asks two questions. She asks number one, you say that the mind is a thing that thinks, but what is it? Don't tell me what it does, what is the mind? And Descartes responds, it's a thinking substance, which is not helpful, it's completely evasive, he never answers her question. But more importantly, she asks a bigger question. She asks, how can the mind, which is not physical, affect the body, which is physical? Because in the science of their day, the only way things affected each other is if a physical object bumped into another one, it could have a causal effect on it, like billiard balls, one knocking into another and making it roll. There was no sense that things could have any other influence on one another other than a direct physical causation. This is kind of lost on modern students because modern students don't have trouble coming up with examples of how things can influence each other without being in contact. But you have to remember, Elisabeth is asking this question in 1643. It wasn't until 1687 that Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica and said there is this gravitational force that heavenly bodies are exerting on one another all the time, and I can calculate the constant for you. And when Newton wrote that, there was an uproar, particularly from another philosopher, Gottfried Leibniz, who said, you can't say that. You're importing the supernatural and the occult into the physical sciences. You can't say that things that aren't touching each other have an influence on each other. And he says, I can calculate the constant for you. And Newton and Leibniz battled each other till the end of their lives over all kinds of different issues. But so Descartes and Elisabeth are writing prior to Newton. She thinks the only way two things affect each other is through physical contact. And so if minds can affect bodies, how? How can minds affect bodies? Minds can't touch them because minds don't exist in space. Now that gets into the heart of philosophy of mind. What is the mind? What is that thinking thing in your head right now? And how does it relate to the brain? And there's a kind of an interesting history now to the question of dual causation. My mind seems to affect my brain, and my brain seems to affect my mind. My mind affects my brain in the sense that I can think something and then my body does it. I can think, I'm going to raise my hand, and then look, the thing just goes up. My mind can actually affect my body, and conversely, my body can affect my mind. Elisabeth and Descartes will talk about hunger, the appetites of the body, which affect the mind and make you then go to the refrigerator and get something to eat. Or we could look at the famous historical case of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker who had a spike shoot through his skull and destroy his frontal lobe. And though he lived, his friend said he just wasn't Gage anymore. He wasn't the same guy, because changing the body actually changes the mind that arises from the body. So how are the two related? Modern philosophers of mind have a slew of different answers to the question, and there is no resolve. But I want to suggest that there are three that we should all be aware of. One, there are still a few dualists left in the world. Not a lot of them, but Richard Swinburne at Oxford is still a dualist. So some people still take the dualist position. A second and more common view is the idea, as monists, the idea that the brain supervenes on the mind. And the way this works is it's kind of like the froth on the wave of the ocean. The wave does the motion, and the froth on the wave just follows along with it. The mind supervenes on the brain. It rests on top of it, but it has no autonomy of its own. If you change anything in the brain, you change something in the mind. If you change anything in the mind, you change something in the brain. That's what supervenience is. You can't have any A changes without similar B changes, is the way philosophers talk about that. Under the realm of supervenience, under the umbrella of supervenience, there are two different ways that philosophers talk about this. One is called non-reductive materialism. And non-reductive materialism says that the mental is somehow different than the physical, but it's still part of the physical world. You have to talk about the mental with different words than you talk about the physical, but they're not the same thing. Famous proponent of non-reductive physicalism is John Searle at Berkeley. And I'll show you how he used to draw this illustration in class when I sat in his classes. He would say, you have a physical state in the brain, P1, which changes the next physical state in the brain, P2. At the same time, physical state 1 gives rise to a mental state, number 1, which influences the following mental state, M2. At the same time, the second physical state of the brain shapes the second mental state of the brain. He says this is how the process works. This is what's going on. The physical brain is giving rise to mental states, and mental states affect one another, but only as what he called emergent properties of the brain. Emergent properties he described this way. He says, imagine H2O. H2O, if you took a hydrogen molecule out of here, you took an oxygen molecule out of here, neither one of them would be liquid. But somehow when you combine them, they form this thing called water, which has liquidity as one of its features. And so liquidity is an emergent property of the physical atoms in the water. In the same way, the mind is an emergent property that arises from the brain. And that is non-reductive materialism. The mind somehow arises from the brain. A second alternative view under supervenience is called then reductive physicalism. And reductive physicalism has a primary advocate in Jaegwon Kim. Let's call it reductive materialism or reductive physicalism. And Jaegwon Kim argues that the mind really is just a product of the brain and has no autonomy of its own. And he has a very specific argument about how causation works. He says you can't have two different things causing the same result. And in Searle's model, P2 is caused by P1, and yet somehow M1 has to be influencing P2 to give rise to M2. And Jaegwon Kim says you can't have multiple causes for one result. That's a little bit peripheral, but that's part of where philosophy of mind is today. Oh, and the third one, the third approach to mind-body relation today is kind of an interesting and quirky one called Panpsychism. And its primary proponent is David Chalmers in Australia. Panpsychism is the belief that at the core of material substance, at the very heart of the physical universe, within atoms themselves, there is something mental. In every atom, there is something mental. The mental lies at the heart of the physical world, just like we talk about string theory and quarks. Somehow, at the lowest level, beyond what we can access, there is something mental in everything. and at a higher order, that gives rise to minds. Chalmers is seen as sort of creative, maybe a little bit eccentric in this, but the view is catching on. I actually read about it in the New York Times again recently, so the view is still spreading, despite the fact that it sounds a little bit like science fiction. So let's go back to Elisabeth and Descartes now. Elisabeth is asking a question which has dominated philosophy of mind ever since. How does the mind affect the brain? Well, if you read the letters back and forth, you're going to be frustrated with Descartes because he basically just avoids her question. He doesn't answer it, certainly doesn't answer it well. And there's a little back and forth between the two of them. In May of 1643, he writes to her and he says, look, everybody's just misunderstanding how minds and brains relate. He says, just like the scholars before us believed that heaviness existed in an object and made it fall to the ground, they thought heaviness was somehow a separate thing that was inside of like a rock that would make it fall to the ground. He says, we're just misunderstanding mind and brain. She writes back to him a couple months later in June and says, okay, now maybe I was doing too much housework and my poor brain is tired. She's being very gracious. She's just being nice to him because he has not answered the question. She goes, maybe I'm confused. Tell me again, how does a mind, which is not physical, affect a brain, which is? And now he writes back, also in June, he writes back immediately, and he says, if it's helpful for you to think of the soul as being extended in space, like a body, just go ahead and do that. And by the way, stop being so philosophical. This is what this great Enlightenment thinker says to this woman who clearly is asking more articulate questions than his answers are providing response. She asked, finally, a couple of years later, she writes on the subject again. They wrote on a number of different subjects through the years, but she writes back and she says, now how can the physical passions like hunger affect the brain? How can the body affect the brain? And Descartes said that inside the body, there are little tiny particles, which he calls animal spirits. This was the science of the day. He didn't invent this. And they travel around in the blood system, which is all physical, and they go up into the brain, and they work the brain like pulleys and levers in order to make it do what they want. And the soul, or the mind, sits up inside the brain, just sort of taking all of this in. And it sits inside a certain gland, he says, called the pineal gland. He says you have 2 eyes and 2 ears and 2 nostrils. The pineal gland is just one, and so that must be where the soul is sitting, taking all of this in. And ever since then, philosophers who read this have laughed at it because it is a ridiculous answer. And so to this day, philosophy of mind is still wrapped up in big questions about how the body and the mind relate to each other. What are they and how do they affect each other? And the truth is, no one knows. But maybe we'll know after you write your brilliant and now well-informed paper on the philosophy of mind. Good luck.